Hi, everybody. Welcome. Welcome to our in-person crowd and our online crowd. My name is Alana Putza, and I am the Senior Program Manager at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI, otherwise known as CFCS. For those of you who don't know CFCS, just a quick word. We are specialists in the intersection of finance and security. Our research aims to unpack the challenges of emerging threats, current and emerging threats from state and non-state actors, and provide realistic policy responses and solutions from a cross-sector perspective. So we cover a range of issues, which we're going to be diving into a bit today. This event today is the second in our autumn series. The first one took place a month ago, and that was covering the transatlantic response to illicit finance that undermines our democracies. And we've got our next one on November 24th, which will look into asset recovery. So stay tuned on our website for that. Today's panel will be looking at cryptocurrency risks and recovery and regulations. And we are very thrilled that we have got a great group, a cross-sector group, and we've also got an expert moderator with us today. A quick admin note, if you are joining us online and if you have any questions, please do submit them via the Q&A box on Zoom. And if you're here in person, just raise your hand and I'm sure our moderator will be happy to call on you. So today's moderator is Scott Chipolina. We're very excited, from the Financial Times, investigative journalist who's been a crypto watcher for a long time. So Scott, over to you. Thanks.
Everyone, and welcome again to the event. I think I'll just kick off with an invitation for our panelists to introduce themselves. Alison, how about we start with you?
Yeah, of course. Hi, everyone. My name's Alison Owen. I'm a research analyst at the Center for Financial Crime and Security Studies at RUSI. I focus primarily on the security and policy dimensions of cryptocurrency.
Yeah, hi, everyone. I'm David Carlisle, the Vice President of Policy and Regulatory Affairs at Elliptic. We're a blockchain analytics firm, so we build anti-money laundering solutions that regulated businesses, government agencies can use to identify illicit activity in crypto.
Hi, Aidan Larkin. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Asset Reality. We're a crypto asset recovery company, so if someone loses their crypto assets or they get hacked, we deal with the victims and help crypto companies sort of manage the victims process better. And on the other side, we then manage seized crypto assets for government agencies, and we also play an important part in helping governments develop the resources and policies and processes they need, basically giving them the tools to deal with sort of the big issues in complex asset recovery, of which digital assets is probably the biggest part of that piece. And in a former life, I was a criminal investigator for Revenue and Customs.
Stuff. Thanks everybody for those introductions. Alison, I think I'll start with you. Obviously over the last few months, towards the last year I suppose, there's been a lot of media coverage of course about cyber and crypto related crime. Just as a bird's eye view to kick us off, could you tell us a little bit about the tactics that you're seeing in terms of illicit crypto finance across the board?
Yeah, I think that North Korea has really taken the stage with media for the past year when it comes to cryptocurrency. The techniques being used seem to be pretty simple, just using spear phishing techniques, trying to attack cryptocurrency companies just to gain access to private keys, for instance. But also you have things kind of on the side outside of cybercrime where even mining has become something that you see more prominently. So in April, the US went after a mining facility based in Switzerland with facilities in Russia known as Bit River. And I think looking at those things, those areas don't get as much attention as you would hope. So with mining facilities, Bit River specifically, they were operating facilities allowing cloud mining services. So anywhere, any person anywhere could remotely mine cryptocurrency. And the US said that it was allowing Russia specifically to circumvent sanctions. So you have everything from cybercrime to the use of mining to circumvent sanctions nowadays. But there's a wide variety of techniques out there, everything from just spear phishing techniques again to just mining.
David, how about you? What sort of stands out to you in terms of the most commonly used tactics?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the trend we're seeing that's emerged most of the past year is that criminals are really becoming more sophisticated in their ability to launder funds across different types of platforms and using different assets on different blockchains. So it sort of, I think historically was the case that, when criminals would earn proceeds in Bitcoin or Ethereum or another cryptocurrency, they were limited to laundering funds across services on a single blockchain. There really wasn't a convenient sort of set of ways to move your funds across different assets very swiftly. What we've seen with the rise of decentralized finance, or DeFi, is the emergence of services like decentralized exchanges, what are known as cross-chain bridges, so services that effectively allow you to move your funds from Bitcoin onto the Ethereum blockchain in an effectively seamless manner. And it's fueling a lot of very positive innovation across crypto space, these new innovations. But what it is doing is we're seeing that criminals like North Korean cyber criminals are able to use these new methods to try to obfuscate their funds flows and are able to launder funds through numerous types of services, especially within the decentralized finance space.
Yeah, interesting. Aidan, same question to you?
Yeah, I think that we see the more sort of sad, real impact of sort of fraud and criminality involving crypto. And I think what's happening is criminals are realizing, why do I have to get involved in the complex drug deal or get involved in other areas when these fraud factories effectively can do things at scale that blockchain technology sort of allows effectively. So rather than a traditional criminal or a Bernie Madoff style character trying to go after a handful of people, you can effectively see these programs and algorithms now that we can chart a victim's journey through crypto, and there is billions being lost in terms of fraud. And we know that the regular response to fraud is poor globally in terms of, because it just doesn't get the headlines. It's not the same as seizing the millions of dollars of sort of cocaine or arms or any of those things. So unfortunately now criminals are waking up to the fact that they can programmatically design scams, and instead of knocking on the door of the vulnerable pensioner, they can just issue these to hundreds of thousands of people. And even on the other side, in terms of the recovery process, if you lose crypto assets or you're a victim of a hack or a scam, if you then even tweet the word "I've been hacked," you automatically get hit by hundreds, if not thousands, of bots and attempts then. And these things are hijacked legitimate Twitter accounts, for example, that seemingly think, we're terrible to hear that that's happened. I was just resolved the other day and I went on to this particular site. And these are not just like one or two people on a computer. These are factories. We've seen in Cambodia the affectionately known pig butchering scams. But there are people behind these. This is just the latest vehicle. So we're seeing now, I think, a maturity in the industry where the existing scammers that were duping people in penny stocks and they were doing different types of scams are now realizing we can put a bunch of people in a factory and we can go after this complicated world of DeFi, where the more everyone gets pushed towards peer-to-peer, that's less touch points. There isn't a friendly exchange in the middle that law enforcement can find your assets at. So my worry is, as we go into the deeper waters of DeFi and this whole where everyone's betting we're all going to go, there are no lifeboats, there are no sort of safety nets out there, and I think fraud is going to be at a sort of an epidemic level, and it's just going to keep going that way.
And we've mentioned as well, early on in this panel, North Korea and Russia. Just interested in your thoughts collectively on who the chief beneficiaries are of this kind of activity. Who are the most powerful? You mentioned North Korea again. Most powerful actors sort of in this space.
Well, I mean, my head always turns to North Korea, just because North Korea has just constantly focused on cryptocurrency, it seems like. I mean, recently, the UN panel of experts report came out, and just going through quickly, you notice that crypto is just a common trend. Everything from issuing Trojanized DeFi wallets, trying to trick people into downloading some of this stuff, to just, I don't know, there's many things that when it comes to North Korea and crypto. So North Korea is always going to be the main focus in the crypto ecosystem through my eyes, but I'm sure you might have different perspectives.
David?
Yeah, I mean, I think North Korea stands out really, certainly among state actors, is by far the most prolific, just in terms of the volume of activity they're undertaking and also their comfort in interacting with crypto. I think the fact that North Korea had a very well-developed and sophisticated cybercrime apparatus even before crypto, has made it very easy for them to kind of transition into this space. I think for other state actors, it's a much more of a mixed picture. I mean, we're not necessarily seeing a lot of concrete evidence of of at least meaningful scale sanctions evasion via Russia using crypto assets. I think there's some limited and anecdotal suggestion of it. There's certainly evidence that Russian-affiliated paramilitary groups that operating in parts of the Ukraine are raising funds with crypto on a more limited scale. But I think there was fear at one point that Russia might attempt to move its entire economy over to Bitcoin or something, which I just don't think was ever really practical. But I think there is some indication that they might be looking longer term as to how they can use Bitcoin or crypto as maybe one sanctions evasion method as the sanctions bite. But we don't really see a lot of concrete evidence of it on a significant scale at the moment.
Right. Aidan, how about you?
Yeah, I think, and again, just for these folks are the experts in terms of the sort of international geographic position. But again, don't fall into the trap of thinking, oh, well, I'm not going to fall victim to a North Korean phishing attempt. Why would they come after me? I mean, we have a case involving a dentist in the UK that lost some crypto assets. When you trace it through, it's part of a wider state-sponsored program that attacked a protocol that he was invested in. So he is very much the real victim sitting in the UK today who's now lost £50,000 of his money because his money was invested in the thing that was targeted. So I think it's easy to read the headlines and think they're just these sort of disparate attacks taking place. It is sort of systematic. But it's also worth just countering that with the fact that it is low-hanging fruit. I mean, they're not going after crypto because crypto's bad. It's just easier. It's much harder for a North Korean group to come across and rob a bank vault. Whereas we have all of these billions of dollars, trillions at sometimes, of assets available. And the fact is the security and the education and awareness hasn't caught up. So I think that whilst we continue to dangle them over the edge, people are going to keep sort of jumping up because the rewards are there for them.
We were talking about this point beforehand, but I mean, something like crypto is just an extremely, essentially no risk, high yield or high opportunity attack vector for someone like North Korea. I mean, it costs them nothing to do things like hack crypto exchanges or DeFi protocols. And if they only, in some of these cases where they're hacking tens or hundreds of millions of dollars from an exchange in a single instance, even if they only succeed in laundering 10% of the funds back to themselves, after 20, 30 hacks, it starts to add up, and it really costs them almost nothing. So I think we will continue to see it as long as the infrastructure is that vulnerable and easy to attack.
Aidan actually made an interesting point there that it's systemic as well. I think it would be interesting to hear your thoughts as to why this is such an important strategy for North Korea. We hear often the phrase that it's an economic lifeline for the regime. To what degree is that true, and why have they gravitated to crypto in particular, again, to Aidan's points, as that economic lifeline that it's often described as?
Well, I think just from the point of North Korea, they are financially isolated, so cryptocurrency is a great alternative to try and raise revenue for their military program. Until we get to a point where regulations are in place across the board, North Korea is going to continue trying to exploit this opportunity. I mean, they know to some extent what they're doing. They have deployed malware in certain circumstances, and they typically go after places where there's a high stakes, where there's a lot of things happening, like for instance, this past year it came out, the DOJ announced that they were able to seize cryptocurrency from a ransomware deployed at a healthcare center in Kansas. At that healthcare center, you have constant so many emails coming through. It's a high stake environment, so you're not going to notice if you get a phishing email in that case. So North Korea is really taking advantage of this opportunity, trying to deploy malware, trying to gain cryptocurrency until people start learning from this.
David, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very low-hanging fruit for a lot of these threat actors. It's easy for them to do. And yeah, I mean, another point we might come to is you still do have substantial pockets, I guess, both globally within countries where regulation is not being implemented on this space, but also components of the ecosystem where it's still not clear how regulation is going to apply. And that just makes the ecosystem very, very vulnerable to a determined threat actor who has the capability to exploit it.
Well, what would you say that actually says about the way that the world has obviously, cryptocurrencies cross borders, and it's a global industry by design, really. Essentially, what does the existence of a threat actor like North Korea in the space say about the way that the world has, perhaps failed to get a handle of some of the biggest illicit risks that the industry presents? Aidan, how we start with you with that?
Yeah, I'm happy to come in on that. I think, again, I'm a big fan of perspective. We failed with the internet. The internet experiment has massively failed in the sense of when we think about online protection for kids. If we think about access to scammers, and we just accept, like, no one ever really calls, everyone calls and again, I don't say, I pride myself on being objective. I'm not a sort of Bitcoin maxi, but I'm a realist, and I think that we don't threaten to shut down the internet because we accept that it does maybe 70 or 80% of things really, really well. And we accept that you type the wrong word into the wrong website, and it could be career ending, or it could be your kids need therapy because they've seen the wrong thing sort of online. And we just accept that that's just a byproduct of this incredible innovation. We don't shut down email because we know spear phishing attacks come through that way, and we know all of the scams long before crypto existed. We accept that this technology it does more good than harm. And I think with crypto, we also have to be realistic about, governments are fighting so many other challenges on so many other fronts that this is a small percentage. And when you don't have, as David has said, when you don't have the additional regulatory pressure that you must do something, again, if you zoom right out, if you're sitting in the North Korean sort of hacking HQ Central, why wouldn't you do it? But it is the easier asset to go after. And if I was trying to smuggle drugs through a port, would I go to the country that has all of the sniffer dogs, all of the border controls, all of the protections in place, or would I go to the country that has nothing? And I think that's what the reality of the situation is with crypto. There are still, I think, these guys will know better than me, I think FATF's last reconciliation was over 40 countries still have zero in place. We're talking people with no training, with no tools. So again, imagine that was like a global narcotics assessment and there was 50 countries without border checks. Then smuggling would be rife. So I think we need to be realistic about the fact that it is such an attractive vector for so many reasons, and we're attempting to now do the biggest technological shift since the internet. That it is just going to be, I think there's a lot of pain still to come, but there's a lot of learning points from sort of how we approached internet and email, and a lot of it is around sort of education and awareness, and if people know to not click on the link, then that might just stop it. And it could be something as simple as that, just basic education. But whilst governments and regulators and everyone argues over whether it's good or bad, these people are going to keep sort of seeing that opportunity, and they're going to stay very busy.
You raised an interesting point as well about the FATF recommendations. I think it'd be interesting to hear your thoughts as to why perhaps these recommendations haven't been. It's been slow to pick up across certain jurisdictions. What are your thoughts as to why perhaps those recommendations haven't been picked up globally at the rate that some people would have liked to have seen?
I think from my perspective, it's just there's no standardized approach. So everyone is trying to implement FATF standards in a different way. And it really just takes, again, reiterating what Aidan said, it really just takes education and training, trying to make sure that everyone understands exactly what FATF is trying to tell them to do, but also how to implement those standards in a very straightforward manner. But at the same time, it takes a lot more than that because it's also the process of enforcement. Maybe when it comes to crypto, some of these jurisdictions just don't have the capability to enforce, actually investigate cryptocurrency cases. I mean, cryptocurrency is unique in that you do need to have a lot of resources. You have to have, at this point, a blockchain analytic tool to actually investigate into crimes. So education and resources are really key to that.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think there is some difference in kind of the nature of the problem across different jurisdictions. So, as Ada mentioned, there are a substantial number of countries that have done nothing or next to nothing when it comes to implementing the FATF standards, which unfortunately isn't necessarily a new problem when it comes to the implementation of the FATF standards, but I think is exacerbated in the crypto space because there are such significant capacity and knowledge gaps. And I think there is an increasingly urgent recognition within the FATF and a policy level globally that there needs to be a real push to build capacity and technical capability within lots of countries around the world, but it's a very hard thing to do, and the technology is moving extremely fast. But then, even within countries like, the US, the UK, Singapore, which have implemented at least some components of the FATF standards, I think even then you have this problem that the technology is just moving much faster than the frameworks and policymakers can even keep up. So, take something like DeFi. I mean, the UK's implemented an AML regime for crypto, but it hasn't even begun to tackle the question of where does DeFi sit in that. The US is attempting to do that, and the US model is largely sort of very enforcement-led, I would say, which uses some quite blunt instruments like sanctions or fines and penalties to try to change behavior in the DeFi space. But I think that's not really, as you were saying, it's not really a sustainable model for many countries that just don't have the resource to do that. Then you have other countries like Abu Dhabi, for example, which has invited DeFi developers and innovators into its regulatory sandbox to kind of try and study this technology, think about how to regulate it, evolve the regulatory framework. And I think that is probably a more viable model for some countries out there, but it takes quite some time to get there, and so it's a problem across the board.
Yeah, I think that's definitely an interesting dynamic between the rate of innovation in this, with the underlying tech and what regulators and policymakers can do. Aidan, what are your thoughts on that subject?
Yeah, I think again, it's keep bringing it back and setting the context against this. I remember when I was in criminal investigation having an international inquiry, and we were surprised as a young investigator that a particular offshore jurisdiction it didn't have the ability to carry out sort of digital forensics, so it couldn't do a quick data dump and look at what was on the phone or was on the laptop. And then you realise that the FIU and the central command there has like 6 people, and they have a couple of laptops. And now all of a sudden we're asking, I'm involved in a UNODC project in Papua New Guinea because a crypto exchange is registered there. No one has ever got on a plane, but they've found a company formation agent. They've got and now all of a sudden they're like, where do we even start with this? And I think that it is like the internet sort of first coming into a country or mobile phones. So I think we're always classically in law enforcement, because there's always that rat race where the criminals are going to be more funded, more innovative and bolder and have no borders. And now you've actually got a borderless technology, whereas everything else was it wasn't on your shores, or it didn't really affect you. So I think this has caught everybody a little bit sort of standing. And we are seeing, I agree with David, those that are embracing it at least stand a better chance. But it is, you think of again from a victim's perspective, it's where and I was told this recently, means where the fraud is sort of taking place often is who investigates it. So who takes the lead on the investigation in a crypto case? Everyone could say, well, it's not me, it's on the blockchain. Didn't happen here, happened in North Korea. So there is this now that governments are saying, well, we don't have the money to fund this. We don't have the money to pay for the tools or do the training. So add it to the queue of the other things we want to address. We acknowledge it's an issue. So I think that, and just to clarify my comments on the countries that haven't implemented the standards, the desire is there. It's like, what can we do right now with limited resources and limited tools? But this is like trying to grab a sort of moving train, I think, at the minute. And until what we're seeing is where the sector deserves credit. I think we're seeing like the template that was laid down in traditional finance with like the joint money laundering sort of task force gimlet. In banking, we're now seeing that in the crypto sector. Sort of all of us sort of here in this panel are involved in different ways, and with the digital asset task force, for example, where the sector is coming together to say, well, what works in sort of TradFi? What are we used to doing in terms of tackling problems? Like money laundering, remember, trillions of dollars is laundered every year, and no one's talking about banning cash. So I think with crypto, there's a bit of sort of context around the scale of the challenge, and the industry's trying to do more. But again, I think there's still a very, very long way to go. But I'll probably hit on this later on. The financial rewards in terms of crypto enforcement, in terms of what governments are able to seize, and the ROI on the work that it takes. Just like the North Koreans, doing the state-sponsored hacking, government agents with a laptop are seizing $1 billion. You cannot do that in traditional asset recovery. So I think that will probably trigger a virtuous cycle that countries that we are working with now are going, we're an offshore jurisdiction, lots of exchanges here, bit of money laundering taking place. We can get involved in this and probably recover millions into our jurisdiction that will address the resources and the IT sort of the technology issue. So we're seeing more of that, and people are copying the best practice.
No, that's a very interesting point. We've spoken a fair bit about state-sponsored actors. I'd like to sort of shift the discussion perhaps a little to non-state actors. For example, the Economic Crime Bill mentions terrorism financing as a particular risk with regard to crypto. What are your thoughts on that, and on the risks that non-state actors pose to the sort of illicit underbelly of the industry? Alison, we start with you.
I think for that, terrorism financing with cryptocurrency is something that is it is happening in some circumstances, but it's going to be probably something that grows over time. I don't think it's the most prominent threat at this point. I mean, Elliptic has done quite a bit of research on even far-right extremism, and I'll let you speak to that. But you can see from the point of view of far-right extremism that there is a pretty heavy focus on cryptocurrency. There are pieces of evidence pointing to the fact that there are terrorist groups in Idlib in Syria that are operating by using physical exchanges based in Idlib and actually having donators send funds, and they can go and cash out funds at those 3 physical locations. But again, it's something that is probably more on the horizon. I think that North Korean activity in this space is definitely something that needs to receive more attention.
Right. David, your thoughts on the same?
Yeah, I mean, on terrorist financing, I mean, you summarized the picture. I think from what we see, it seems to be still quite limited. We don't really necessarily see that most terrorist financing campaigns have evolved in terms of their sophistication or their size or scale. Certainly kind of when it comes to, say, jihadist terrorism, it seems to be quite limited. The techniques are fairly basic. As Alison said, we do probably actually see more activity when it comes to far-right extremism, where there often seems to be a bit of an ideological component to why some of those actors use Bitcoin, because it's sort of non-state affiliated, it's taking down the banks, that kind of thing. And so they see some natural connection to want to use it. But I think when it comes to non-state actors, I mean, really what we tend to see is still, I think, is activity like fraud, ransomware is really probably maybe the most significant now, which can sometimes be state affiliated, but not always. And things like, the continued use of darknet markets, where even though there have been, successful takedowns of them, we see new ones arise. So, it continues to be many of the same actors. I think what we are starting to see is that many of those actors, as I mentioned at the beginning, are evolving their techniques of money laundering in this space to leverage more of these newer innovations, things like DeFi, to try to obfuscate what they're doing and move more of their transactions away from the regulated components of the crypto ecosystem, like more centralized exchanges that are now, at least in the major financial centers, are quite heavily regulated or becoming heavily regulated, often apply KYC, really aren't great avenues for money laundering now. It's more DeFi is kind of the place to go, and that's where we're seeing them migrate.
Right. Aidan, same question, but with an added component to it. What are your thoughts broadly on what the UK has done so far to get a regulatory understanding about the industry, and what else can it do in the future?
So with the first sort of the part of the question, I think that in terms of where it's going to go, I think that, and for those that don't have a huge crypto background in terms of investigations, I mean, this is the most traceable asset in the world. I mean, if you're a fraudster, you should not be using Bitcoin or any form of digital asset, because it's like taking a £20 note, being able to type in the serial number, and you can see everywhere it has ever been, and you can track it automatically in perpetuity. So criminals don't want, and they shouldn't be using crypto assets, frankly, but they're using it because no one's looking. And that's where, so I do think that those traditional crimes will go away. I think that it's opportunistic because there's gaps taking place. But I think there is this other perfect storm where, as the technology advances, and I agree with David, people won't launder through a well-known exchange, because they have, like most exchanges have law enforcement liaison teams. They're getting better. But then when you bring in the DeFi side of things, so I think this is where this rat race will happen. The attention will turn to the peer-to-peer transactions, where it's much easier. There will be better scope for laundering, but then there's still that immutable trace that can take place. So frankly, you'd be better off sticking with sort of real estate and paintings and precious metals and things, because they're still easier to launder than crypto assets sort of are, frankly. I think that what you will see, the other side though, is my personal sort of opinion is that theft and fraud will be the single biggest sort of issue going forward. When we see that the amount of people that are involved in sort of gaming, we look at the sort of the Gen Z population. I think I read recently there's something like 80% of the Gen Z population, of the millionaires, 50% of them, their assets are in crypto assets. And this figure of like 3 billion people in the world are involved in gaming in some way, shape or form, whether it's an old age pensioner playing Candy Crush, or it's a kid who lives on sort of Fortnite or World of Warcraft. Those types of things are naturally migrating. Brands like Gucci are involved in metaverse. Again, everyone thought the internet was going to be a field. The Daily Mail says, don't worry about the internet, it's a fad. So there will be this move. We're seeing these big brands going into this space. So I think the opportunities for fraud will become bigger, because there will be a wider net, and again, we'll be swimming in deeper, sort of wider waters away from sort of safe shores, to use the analogy. So I think fraud's going to be the big issue. I think the UK has done actually a very good job in terms of the enforcement and law enforcement side, in terms of being really transparent. The recent sort of changes to the bill that they've put out, which is quite unusual. And again, my learned colleagues will correct me if I'm wrong here, but I haven't seen, outside of crypto assets, such a real, this is what we're going to do, this is why we're changing it, this is how we think it's going to improve things. We normally don't see that with traditional asset recovery as much. So I think in terms of the UK's response, again, money talks. Everyone's looking across the pond going, how have the US seized $8 billion in digital assets? The entire United States normally recovers about 2 to 3 billion per year in all assets. And in digital, they're already at 8. So everyone's seeing this enormous opportunity, and that's why we're seeing the opportunities. I think where the UK is going to have a major issue, and it's not just the UK, it's the brain drain that takes place. Trying to recruit people that have the expertise in this sector, when the minute they get good at the job, naturally people are going to look for better opportunities. And if you're an investigator in crypto assets and law enforcement, you've got very well funded sort of VC-backed companies saying, come work over here and use that expertise over here. So I think even though there's good legislation and good recommendations, it's been brilliant to see in the UK really addressing the specific crypto challenges. So if I'm a law enforcement investigator and you have illicit assets, I can freeze your assets on suspicion that they may be later taken from you in a sort of confiscation or forfeiture process. So the amendments are things like being really specific about the issues that a defense lawyer might try and grab you on. So they might say, you can freeze my assets, but you're not allowed to create a crypto wallet to move my assets across. That's not catered for. So they're being really specific, saying if we freeze it, we can actually recreate your wallet. We can do all of these additional things that maybe they're cutting off a potential sort of defense sort of vector. Make it really clear on if we seize your assets because they're volatile, we will push and we will give the magistrates court, give the powers there that they can convert those assets. These things have all been for debate over the last couple of years. So I think that the UK has done a really good job in making that really clear. My worry is, are the resources there? And with the current government and the current funding, again, there's so many priorities. Fraud doesn't traditionally get much funding or much support. Victims get a bit browbeaten and give up. You look at the rates, and again, it's no criticism of organisations like Action Fraud and others. They're not enforcement agencies. And there's just, the response to fraud is a concern to me. Put crypto assets and the explosion of DeFi and everything else, I don't want to say it's a bleak outlook, but I think there's problems coming, and I think legislation reform is great, but unless, when we saw the last changes, and Helena Wood would be a wonderful person to talk about this from Lucy's perspective, in asset recovery a number of years ago, lots of new powers came in with asset recovery, but it was taking 2 years to get people trained. So if you can't get the people trained to use the new powers, and you can't tool all of the investigators with all of these excellent analytic tools that can make your job easier because you don't have the budget, it just may, again, we may be sort of stuck for a little while. But I think definitely the UK deserves credit for bringing out such a transparent set of clear guidelines as to what it's going to do with crypto. But money talks. So I'll look forward to seeing what the statistics are in terms of seizures over the next sort of 12 to 18 months.
Yeah, those are very good points. I'd like to come back actually to asset seizure in a minute, but before we do that, before we move on from the UK, Alison and David, interested to hear your thoughts on the broader regulatory regime in the UK that's in place, and perhaps what pitfalls there might be, and what can be done in the future.
I think I'll turn this one over to David because I know David has some good insights on this.
Yeah, I mean, I think at like a very high level, kind of the macro level, I think the UK still really needs to articulate what it wants from crypto and what it wants its position to be. Does the UK really want to be a hub of innovation for crypto and a home to crypto companies? Earlier in the year, Treasury made quite a bold announcement saying we want to be positioned UK as a leader for crypto. Made some high level indications of what that might mean, but I still don't think there's really been a clear roadmap of how the UK is going to get there that's been put forward. And there's also been, I think, some confusion in the industry as to what the real position is because, well, you maybe have the policymakers saying something on one hand, at an operational level, it's been very, very difficult for crypto firms to actually get authorized by the FCA to set up here. So there's been a very, very high barrier to entry for those firms who are also being told, we want you here. And so I think there's a lot of ambiguity and some probably ambivalence about within the UK about what the positions should be, and I think really needs to be clarified in order to get to the best place when it comes to a policy framework. And I think the urgency on that is growing because if you just look across to Europe, where they are in the very late stages of finalizing their markets and crypto asset regulation, or MiCA. And for those who might not be familiar, MiCA is a kind of a behemoth of regulatory provisions that the EU is very close to finalizing that will expand the EU regulatory framework for crypto well beyond anti-money laundering to things like market conduct, consumer protection, stablecoin issuance, a very broad range of provisions. And you might look at that and think, well, the crypto industry probably doesn't like that because it's very onerous, and it will be, and it's big piece of regulation, which the crypto industry maybe is always the most comfortable with. But actually, the response of the crypto industry has been extremely positive, which is to say, Europe, in setting out what is, yes, quite a potentially onerous piece of regulation, is at least giving us a roadmap so that we know what the rules are going to be over the next 5 to 10 years, and we can prepare for that. And what we are starting to see is some countries within Europe try to position themselves to be hubs like France for crypto activity. And I think the industry sees a contrast with that when they look at the UK, where there is more of a piecemeal approach to putting all these pieces of regulation together. And I think also goes with the same can be said for the US. And so I think really the UK just needs to put forward a very clear roadmap of what and vision of what it wants to be when it comes to crypto and how it's going to get there, because I think at the moment it's not entirely clear, and that leads to a lot of policy and regulatory ambiguity in the practical sense.
On that point, would you say that, because it was an interesting point that you made about the Treasury statement a few months back, and the high barrier to entry that the FCA has sort of presented to the industry, would you say that there's for want of a better phrase, a conflict of perspective here from, between the Treasury and the government and the regulator? Is that something that might be stopping that clear roadmap? Yeah,
there certainly seems to be. And I think it seems possible to me that you can have, a meaningful regulatory framework with, relatively high barriers to entry that keeps things you don't want out, but isn't too prohibitive, while also being attractive to innovators. I think there have been, as I mentioned, Abu Dhabi seems to be, I think, is a jurisdiction doing some very interesting things in that respect. I think it's going to be very interesting to see how MiCA plays out. But I think the thing that certainly the industry is really seeking is clarity about what the next several years are going to be like when it comes to a regulatory framework, and the fact that you have one arm of the government saying we want it this way, and another arm saying you can't get in. I think it just creates a lot of confusion about where things are at.
I just wanted to come in on that. I think it's worth sort of setting and I completely agree with David. I think that it's worth sort of zooming out and seeing that this is the issue that we see all around the world. We have the sort of the MENA region, and particularly in Latin America as well, where you have countries that have lots of sort of hyperinflation. The crypto adoption is at levels we do not even comprehend in the UK. In terms of understanding of digital assets and using digital assets. If you're in the UK, you've probably never used Vodafone to send money to somebody as a regular thing. If you live in Egypt, that's every day. If you're in Nigeria, you will use mobile money. That is just how people live and how people operate when they can't get a bank account. I'm slightly, I don't want to say I'm controversial, but it may be a divisive opinion. Part of me sort of looks at everything that's going on with MiCA and all the regulations. I sometimes sit back and say, is that the best use of all of our efforts with something like crypto? I think there is a fundamental lack of understanding about what this is and where it's going. And not that I know the answer, and I think it's like everyone coming together to truly regulate the internet. Everyone accepted straight away that wasn't possible. Simply couldn't do it. You couldn't have that technology with a guide rail around it, because who looks after the enforcement? Who takes that case on? Everyone's given up, and it's just accepted. The software will figure itself out, and we'll enforce and we'll do things and we'll shut down bad actors. And when you look at where crypto is currently, if all of the MiCA things come in, if all of the UK regulations come in, I'll just set up in Papua New Guinea with my digital exchange. Customers will go. We have proven there is a want for this technology, and we have proven that institutions will spend trillions of dollars and be involved in this, and everyone sees this as the next sort of horizon. Listening to the digital asset summit that took place in London over the last 2 days, the big prediction is 24/7 digital asset trading, fractionalized ownership, tokenized ownership all around the world. That you can be sitting in the Philippines and you can be trading in Apple stock without going through traditional stockbrokers. So if that's where the industry's headed, it almost becomes, I would never say meaningless. I'm definitely not saying that. But I just think in terms of like where the current focuses are, it's not going to have the effect. Yes, it's going to kick it out of your back garden, and you'll not have none of those pesky crypto companies in your jurisdiction if you've got really strong regulations. But it's not going to address any of the problems we've just talked about in terms of terrorist financing and those sort of pieces. And truthfully, I don't know the long-term answer to that. But I think it is worthwhile noting that it is very, very common. We go into jurisdictions, and on one side, the law enforcement are saying crypto is not an issue here, or we're banning it altogether. And at the same time, the guy from the central bank has said we're launching a digital currency tomorrow. And there is that constant sort of, and I think because it is a divisive topic, and who gets responsible for babysitting it is probably the reason why you're seeing that sort of fractured approach. But it is all around the world, and it's such an easy political football as well. We see this play out en masse in the US, where Kim Kardashian gets prosecuted. I can think of 1,000 people I would prosecute in front of her, but she's a big name, and it's going after the sort of TikTok sort of crypto offences as opposed to the institutional sort of problems as well. So it's a long-winded way of saying I think everyone's in the same boat as the UK with this sort of contrasting, almost sort of schizophrenic sort of position on crypto.
I think that's a really useful segue as well to a discussion about the more niche side of this industry. And one thing I think it would be really useful to discuss with all of you is Tornado Cash. For the benefit of those who may not know what Tornado Cash is, it's a mixing service that allows users to obfuscate his or her transactions. And recently in the States, it was designated by the Office of Foreign Assets Control. Alison, you have some thoughts on that? How do regulators and governments and law enforcement agencies around the world get a grip on again, the more niche side of this industry? Not talking about centralized exchanges and companies that we can reach out and touch, but smart contracts and software that's decentralized like Tornado Cash. How do we sort of come to an understanding about that side of the tech?
Well, I mean, we were talking about this before as well. With Tornado Cash, it did seem to make a big impact with what actually occurred. I would say that Tornado Cash is just going to be the start of it. Criminals are just going to keep finding new ways, the path of least resistance, if you will, to find new avenues for laundering cryptocurrency. But I'll turn it over to David for looking at it from the blockchain perspective. But it really made an impact, actually, sanctioning Tornado Cash.
Yeah, I think, Tornado Cash was a very prolific mixing service on the Ethereum blockchain. I think when we looked at the figures, it had processed about $7 billion worth of transactions, at least 20% of which, or about $1.5 billion, were actually illicit. A substantial portion of that was related to North Korean money laundering. So there's no surprise really that it was targeted by the U.S. Treasury. There are actually now some court cases looking at whether OFAC actually had the authority to do that. But certainly in terms of the aim of the sanction, insofar as it seems to have been to disrupt activity, I mean, we are seeing some indication that it appears to be having some success. The volume of transactions that are being processed through Tornado Cash has declined fairly significantly in recent weeks, which means firstly that fewer criminals are using it, but also that it becomes less effective as a mixer, because a mixer is only as effective as the number of transactions that are passing through it. So it does seem to have some impact in that sense. Also, regulated crypto exchanges around the world will absolutely not touch any transaction or token that seems to have touched Tornado Cash. They don't want to go near it, which seems to be killing off some of the liquidity. We actually did a report last week that we issued at Elliptic looking at some of the potential alternatives to Tornado Cash. So there are some additional mixers on the Ethereum blockchain that criminals could at least theoretically use. So what we see is that they are actually quite small mixers, and none of them are really prepared, at least immediately, to absorb the volume of illicit activity that Tornado Cash was. So in terms of what the sanctions were aiming to do, it does seem to, at least in the near term, had some meaningful impact. I think, going back to one of my points before, that things like OFAC sanctioning Tornado Cash, these are extremely blunt instruments, and I think not necessarily substitute for actually trying to find ways to meaningfully apply regulation in the DeFi space in a way that is more kind of sustainable and scalable and works with the technology and tries to bring those actors within the ecosystem who are interested in maybe working with regulators or finding a way to be legitimate versus things like this, which are, I think, more edge cases. And I do think we will probably see OFAC sanction more components of the DeFi ecosystem over time. But I think, those represent, I think those are kind of aberrations, or need to be, in terms of what regulators are trying to accomplish. I think they really need to be thinking about how do we work with the entire ecosystem here to bring it within the framework and help innovators accomplish what we're trying to accomplish, which is reducing crime without necessarily trying to just rely purely on blunt instruments or just kind of overlay the old rules on top of this new technology in a way that can sometimes be quite crude and doesn't always really work very effectively.
Yeah, Aidan, I'd like to pitch the same question to you, but also interested to know your thoughts on how significant of a move was this by OFAC? Is that, to David's point, is this sort of, for want of a better phrase, a paradigm shift in the way that sanctions policy operates and targets software as opposed to people and companies?
Again, for those that don't know, it has been a very divisive thing. Again, I'm not going to be that guy. I don't want to have a soundbite that says they were wrong to do it, because quite clearly it was involved in illicit activity, and you should shut stuff like that down. But again, I'm going to keep dragging it back to context. I mean, lots of people speed and break the law. Lots of people drink drive every year. So you catch one, you prosecute them, but you don't close the roads, and you don't sort of take all of the cars off the road and ban vehicles. And there is an argument, an academic argument, and a US exchange is funding the legal action against the US government, saying that you're attacking technology. If this was a big shopping mall called Tornado Cash with owners behind it, then I think going after entities that are profiting and actually shutting those down, of course, every recommended person wants that to stop. But again, to David's point about blunt instruments, it's again, do we shut down email because of scams? Do we shut down the internet because of the proliferation of child pornography, for example? So I don't, but again, I have so much sympathy for government and regulators, because this is like the example of a startup company. This is building the plane as you've already jumped off the cliff type of thing. And we'd all love to sit back and have an academic approach to this and try and solve this. But at the same time, like, the tills are ringing every millisecond. And so do we look at a more sort of collaborative approach and say that, again, the outcome of the legal action will dictate whether it's used? I think if you speak to anybody that works in the traditional sort of AML space, or anyone in sort of senior government, they'll always talk about no one wants to take on the big complex money laundering investigations, because governments are politically motivated, individuals are politically motivated. You want to be the mayor or the chief of police in charge of the big gun seizure, the big drug seizure. So this is such a big problem that I would worry that going after these blunt instruments, get big headlines, have big results attached to them. People will get voted into office off the back of these big results if they work. That doesn't mean that they're going to be effective, and it doesn't mean it's going to really move the needle. Because someone will be sitting right now thinking, how on earth do I become and develop the software that does this, and how do I profit from this, and on a dark website? But it's going to happen. It'll just move somewhere else. But again, that doesn't mean we shouldn't close the doors either. So I think I'll come back to me and sort of, well, I was going to say in a couple of months, but the appeals on these types of things, this could be years before this case is resolved. But I think the impact it's made in terms of press and PR means we'll probably see lots of more similar things like that, because I think, to be honest, that's probably all they can do right now.
I mean, to your last question, I do think OFAC is pending the court decisions, but I think they will see the ability to target sort of DeFi protocols as pivotal to what they do, because if threat actors like North Korea are routing their transactions through these protocols and the US government has no ability to stop it, that fundamentally undermines the entire framework of what sanctions are even achieving to accomplish. So, they're clearly going to go into this fight aiming to win it, and if they do, they will, I think, unquestionably double down. So I think it could very well, I think we will see it persist.
Yeah, no, very interesting points. I think we've got some questions, coming in from the online audience, but before I get to those, I'd like to open up to the floor that's here. If anybody has any, so, yeah.
Hi. I talk about this a lot on the regulation side of things. Mentioned on the panel.
We'll give you a mic,
I work a bit on this, on the regulatory side of things, and it's been talked a bit about on the panel, is the issue with retaining skills within government and in this basis, but also I want to ask, with your companies, with your organisations, do you find it hard to actually get the people in the first place? Is there a lot of competition for that kind of skill set? And what does the pipeline look like for that skill set? Is that going through a university degree? Is that teaching themselves by themselves? Or what's the process for that currently?
I'm happy to just quickly talk about
Sure.
the practical side. Again, as a former investigator for government and for the public sector, we keep, without sort of sounding like Tony Blair, education. So unless you have people coming through, doing masters, the only opportunity for me was something like criminology, whereas actually what I need to be doing is a degree in financial investigation. Like, unless we actually start to address this early doors, all you're trying to do is flip someone who maybe has an interest in digital forensics or IT to then get them into that world, and you're already way behind. So I think the short-term outlook is complicated. I mean, people can literally 3 or 4 times their salary by moving from the public sector to the private sector in this space, because there is so much attention in the space. Also remember, post sort of COVID and everything, it's entirely remote. So you don't even have a geographical advantage anymore, that at least I have a job going in London, so I have London candidates. Everyone is applying for jobs all around the world, which also means the local candidates are working overseas as well. So I genuinely do think that's the biggest issue that's going to face law enforcement is resources. The legislation, really good changes in the legislation, really good changes in enforcement. But until you have more education, so again, the other way to tackle it is around more education targeted at the people who are victims of scams and fraud. Because if the low-hanging fruit doesn't exist to the same extent, then you'll not have. So it's more of a preventative measure. It might be a thing, but you can speak more about the big private sector dealing with stuff.
Yeah, I mean, certainly within government, I think what we are seeing is that historically, as it were, I think you tend to have. It tended to be the case before that you might have, say, law enforcement investigators who kind of had to cut their teeth very quickly on a crypto-related case, learned about it kind of on the fly, acquired all the skill sets, then maybe moved to the private sector. Now I do think what we are starting to see is that government agencies are starting to invest in more sort of systematic training of certain staff, but it varies tremendously between countries in terms of the depth of that training and capability, and also even between agencies within specific countries. So it's definitely not an even picture at the moment by any means. I do think the brain drain problem is a huge issue. The Department of Justice actually flagged this as an issue in a report it produced a few weeks ago, actually, in response to President Biden's executive order, where they actually called out the fact that so many government investigators who are becoming skilled in crypto investigations are just leaving for the private sector, and we can't afford to stop them from doing it. And they actually even raised the possibility of looking to have some of the legislation changed to enable them to be more dynamic in the benefits that they can offer to staff to be able to try to retain them. And so I think that is going to be a continued problem, even as governments get, build more capacity internally.
But also, just quickly, we shouldn't perceive this as a bad thing. Like, let's be clear. The people that are leaving law enforcement, and I put myself in that bucket, are going into the private sector to build the tools that will affect this. I mean, if we didn't have private sector companies like David's company, like the others, who are actually building analytic tools, we wouldn't have any of these seizures. We wouldn't have shut down Tornado Cash. The regulators and lawmakers, I think, again, and this is going to sound defensive, but I think actually the education piece needs to come at the very, very top of the regulatory and the sort of those that are involving the legislation and actually curating it. I think that's where, and we're seeing this. I was literally contacted today by a politician involved in the economic crime bill saying we want to get more input. So we're seeing more public and private sector collaboration, because remember, that's what kicked all of this off in the first instance, from the Mt. Gox case, the first big crypto investigations, Welcome to Video, biggest child exploitation site taken down. If it wasn't for private sector blockchain analytic tools, you wouldn't have 300 people now arrested and lots of them victims of these crimes. So I think going into the private sector isn't a bad thing, because it will, because the tools are sort of being used back in. But I think education will be.
Yeah. I think the brain drain problem is something that I would expect naturally to alleviate over time a bit, just as training on things like blockchain analytics just becomes more and more a routine part of how government investigators or staff are
especially
operating in their day-to-day.
It's just going
to become part of the fabric of what they do at some point. But I think certainly in the interim phase, a lot of agencies are flagging it as an immediate issue for them.
Someone recently said this is 1996 in the internet days. So we actually should be almost realistic that we're probably doing a pretty good job as a global community in terms of tackling this, I mean, in terms of the scale of the issue. And we'll look back in 10 years' time and sort of laugh at, remember, we used to do it that way.
And I think if you look at the picture today, it's evolved substantially from even 2 years ago, 4 years ago. I mean, I spent all my time kind of going around and talking to regulators around the world. 4 years ago, you went into many regulatory agencies, people had almost didn't even have the vocabulary to talk about a lot of this stuff. Now you get some people within regulatory agencies around the world who have an extremely sophisticated understanding of a lot of the technology. And so, it's not perfect. There's still gaps to fill there, but I'm ultimately optimistic about where that's going, in a lot of places.
I think we had another question on that side of the aisle. Yeah.
Oh, here's my.
Firstly, thank you to the panelists. It's been a really, really interesting event and discussion. My question is, I work in cybersecurity, so I am all about education for prevention, but in terms of technology intervention points, especially on the DeFi space like peer-to-peer transactions, are there any areas that you think would be interesting to sort of throw more capital at? I don't know, like escrow services. Is there anything that you see as a particularly useful tool?
For me, it's, if you were to bring in a regulation in a country, if you have, remember, the big institutions aren't involved in crypto mainstream. The mainstream banks aren't involved in crypto. The mainstream, like Gucci and some of the big brands, are getting more metaverse. So I think like the basic customer service expectations, if something goes wrong on your credit card, you've got Visa chargeback. Just happens. You know, someone uses your card overseas, it just gets fixed. So I think that when the big institutions come in with their standards around brand and PR, they will demand changes. One of the things that I would like to see more of, if you're going to regulate in a jurisdiction and you've got a big company already based who can't go off to Papua New Guinea and set up an exchange, if they're already here in London, for example, well, let's have something like mandatory screening of outbound transactions in crypto. So if I have a crypto wallet and I'm about to send it somewhere else, as a user, tell me, the law of the land is you have to get this screened in a preventative way. So if it's a known scam, in the same way Gmail tells you this link is suspicious, when you go to send money across to, if you transfer it in your bank account, it'll say on your online portal, you think you're sending it to David, do you know you're actually sending it to a company, and the names don't match? No one argues about privacy there. They're like, that's a sensible thing to do. So I think having things like that, and not necessarily mandatory is a big word, but even something to say, just things like that. We have lots of data sets. We can see where the bad addresses are. We can see, and it absolutely pains me when someone comes to me at 11 o'clock on a Monday morning as a victim of crypto scam, and at 11:05 someone comes along, victim of the same scam. And we knew about it here. We knew about it at the first point, but there isn't, and then everyone talks about data privacy, you can't share it. You know, it's the blockchain. You can share it. So if the big companies, I think, come in cybersecurity and there's a bigger focus on screening, I think there's just such a massive amount of preventative things that we could do that aren't being taken up on yet.
I think just before I go back to the audience, I've got a couple of really interesting questions from the online audience here that I think, Alison, you'd be able to speak on quite well. So I'll just ask two of them because they're so closely related. One is there a lot of non-state engagement with North Korea in crypto? And the second question, also on North Korea, is what action should be taken against those North Korean groups, presumably state or non-state, depending on your response, that have been mentioned throughout the discussion?
So from the point of view of North Korea, there's a few instances here and there where North Korea has worked with just third-party individuals for money laundering. So I guess one of the most prominent cases was Tian Lee. So Tian Lee actually operated a money laundering business in the US, and an indictment ended up coming out a few years ago, but they were actually laundering funds on behalf of North Korea. And again, just recently with the recent seizure of funds following a ransomware attack on the healthcare center in Kansas, in the press release by the Department of Justice, they did mention that those funds were tracked down to, traced back to a money launderer in China. So there are a few cases where North Korea is working with some third-party services, but I think just going over to David again, I think David had mentioned a good point before this, that a lot of the transactions for North Korea specifically, it's very automated. I'll let you speak more on that.
Yeah, I mean, we've definitely seen North Korea use a wide variety of techniques, and I think they sort of will deploy one. When it stops working, they just move on to the next one. You know, we've seen them, you know, in some at least publicly limited instances of, you know, working with potentially professional money launderers. We do see that they effectively kind of automate the money laundering process in a lot of cases, by building scripts that kind of move funds through numerous wallets. So there's a variety of ways we see them do it. I mean, the primary kind of typology we were seeing until the Tornado Cash sanctions, by in fact, was that essentially North Korea would hack various services, they'd steal a large volume of crypto assets, they would move those funds to a decentralized exchange service and try to obtain new assets, which they then launder through Tornado Cash before then sending them on to regulated businesses. So by taking out Tornado Cash in the equation, I think again it proved fairly disruptive from what we can tell to the what has been the primary typology that North Korea was using. Again, is it really sustainable though to keep kind of going after every service by service and sort of playing whack-a-mole in that way? I'm not really sure. I would say though, I think one of the things that's really changing significantly is the ability of things like blockchain analytics to trace funds through these types of typologies and through these types of services. So because in the DeFi space, transactions are all recorded on the blockchain using what are called smart contracts, when a threat actor like North Korea swaps funds through a decentralized exchange service, we can in essence sort of trace through it and keep following the funds, even where they've maybe swapped one asset for another. And so what we are finding now is that law enforcement agencies and regulated businesses are able to use these kind of multi-chain screening capabilities to follow funds as they're moved from one asset or one blockchain to another now. So the tracing capabilities are becoming much more sophisticated, and I think that's going to actually play potentially a bigger role in disrupting some of this stuff over the longer term than maybe kind of some of these blunt form instruments that again are just maybe not very sustainable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think this gentleman had a question up front.
Hi, thanks very much. Possibly a question for the gentleman about the relationship between law enforcement and the private sector. How does this work in practice? I mean, is it the case that at Elliptic you're finding things and then coming to law enforcement saying we've got this problem, to what extent are these investigations being done ultimately by the private sector? I mean, obviously, Aidan, you mentioned large takings by US law enforcement, but then also the conversation's been around how much difficulty law enforcement's had in retaining talent. So presumably, there's a lot of investigative work being done in the private sector. So to what extent does that break down, and how does it work in practice?
Should I take the first part of it, or you take the second one? So I think, I'd say at this point, I think in kind of the US, the UK, kind of the major financial centers and such, I would say most, not all, law enforcement agencies are using blockchain analytics capabilities in-house in some fashion. So many of them are utilizing these tools themselves, deploying them in investigations, have analysts who are increasingly trained up in the ability to actually utilize these tools. So I think in most cases, what we are seeing is there's a desire to have at least some capability in-house within most major law enforcement agencies now to be able to actually track and trace the funds, as it were, on their own and independently. That said, conducting certain investigations can require capacity that they sometimes don't have. It can also require or maybe the case that certain investigations are so sophisticated that they need to bring in other investigators. So I do think we see that there are many cases where at least some or all components of certain investigations are outsourced to the private sector, to private sector firms. But I'd say it's really a bit of a hybrid approach at the moment, where you see most of these agencies try to bring at least some of the capacity in-house and to be able to hold it there, but also working closely in outsourcing some of that capacity to the private sector. I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, no, I would agree that, it's quite right and quite proper that law enforcement should be able to do all of this themselves, but it's like anything, that's just not practical. And I think that's not a crypto issue. Digital forensics. So if you're the Met Police or the City of London Police, of course you're going to have the resources and you're going to have in-house laboratories that can do digital forensics, for example. But if you're a small police force in the very tip of the Highlands of Scotland, for example, in a remote location, it might be that you don't have that expertise, and you'll use procurement processes to bring in sort of private sector companies where you have a gap. I think where crypto, and it's an optimistic thing, is that with crypto, because you have this sort of democratization of all of the data, it's all there. If a banker would sit behind a privacy law and say, I can see that this is suspicious activity, I'm going to cover my back and I'm going to send in a suspicious activity report, but no one in that bank would have the permission to go and dig a little bit deeper and say, actually, I think he's involved in a laundering ring, I think he's involved in terrorist financing, and we've done X, Y, and Z. But actually what you see from a blockchain analytic perspective, if I get that first report from someone to say my funds have been stolen, I can see that actually, use Madoff as the analogy. If someone comes in and says, I'm a victim of this scam, you couldn't see outside of that first deposit they made into a bank account But with blockchain analytics, I can look and say, well, I know you've lost 100,000, and I can see there's actually 1,000 other deposits into these accounts. It's actually a really big case here. So what we're finding is some of the biggest crypto seizures have taken place because of that initial disclosure. The private sector companies are taking it to law enforcement saying, you really need to do something with this case. There's a big case here. So I think there's a lot of really positive sort of joint agency task forces where people are trying to sort of bridge the gap where there is that sort of brain drain or lack of resources. We particularly see that in developing jurisdictions that simply do not have the people to be able to carry out the investigations, where there's an outsourcing. But again, that's been done way back sort of pre the Palantir days. That's been done by data companies for a very long time, giving information to law enforcement. So it's not a new thing, but I think it's a really good point. It's a good way of optimistically saying that the resources issue doesn't need to be a big challenge if governments use procurement processes to sort of plug the gap, just like bringing in contractors to do other activities when you don't have the resources. Thank you.
I think just before we move on to final comments, we probably have time for one more question. Anybody has a question in the audience? Yes, the lady over there, the man over there, please.
How prolific would you say is cryptocurrency usage by threat actors, be they state-based or non-state-based, for financial crime or in aiding of other strategic aims?
I mean, I think while we're seeing growing use of crypto by state actors, I think, you know, it's a component of their overall activity, whether it's sanctions evasion or other forms of illicit activity. It's still a relatively small component of what they do. I don't know. I couldn't give you a number of, you know, in terms of, you know, as part of North Korea's overall sanctions evasion or weapons proliferation activity, what does crypto comprise precisely? I mean, I think by most estimates, including, you know, our own as Elliptics, you know, North Korea has probably amassed a couple $2 billion worth of crypto. You know, that's a meaningful amount of money, and it undermines the integrity of the sanctions regime. But I think if you took crypto out of the equation, North Korea would still have plenty of ways to evade sanctions. So, you know, I think we do have to keep it in perspective in some sense. I think it is just, for a lot of the reasons we discussed today, I think it is becoming an increasing problem. But, you know, I don't think it is the primary method through which, you know, a lot of state-based actors are engaged in a lot of their activity.
I would just add to that really quickly. A lot of blockchain analytic companies have come out with different data sets saying that criminal activity in the crypto space is very small. But I would say that there are other areas within the crypto space. A lot of activity takes place that's off-chain. So you have people just handing over hard drives with crypto on it, getting cash in return. You have some mining activity that might not necessarily show up on chain. So when you see that small percentage, you kind of have to take that with a grain of salt. It's a lower threshold. There's going to be a bit more activity taking place, but for most estimates, the overall criminal activity in the crypto ecosystem is very small.
I would just add to that. I think that I completely agree. Remember, with crypto, you can blatantly see the bad stuff. Like, there is an immutable link. So it's almost, I don't want to say it's easy, but it's absolutely, it's irrefutable when something has touched the dark web or a state-sponsored attack. I don't like the perception that the figure is small, simply because our sort of focus is around victims, and those stats don't take into consideration money laundering, tax evasion, fraud. I mean, one of the biggest sort of crypto stories in the UK is the fantastic Jamie Bartlett investigation, the missing crypto queen. I mean, there's no crypto in that case. That was a fraud case. There's people talk about it's a crypto crime. There's no such thing. If someone breaks into someone's property today and steals a Rolex or a painting, they don't go to the Rolex team in the Met or the painting team. It's theft. It's burglary. So with crypto cases, we don't see the examples. And I think there is this obsession with North Korea and others, quite rightly, and that comes from the basis of we have the tools to prevent things more than we're currently utilizing. So there's a fix there that isn't possible in traditional money laundering. We know we have lost the battle with money laundering. 4 to 5 trillion is laundered every year is the estimate in normal banking. We can't stop that tomorrow. But with crypto, there's almost a frustration because the art of the possible dictates that we could shut things down even more. But to be absolutely brutal and bring things back to the UK, the cases we see is someone on a dating website, because they've called themselves Mr. Crypto on Twitter, and they've got a valuable NFT. They meet someone on a dating site, someone comes to the house and puts a knife to their throat and gets the seed word of their account. This is not state-sponsored hacking. This is people just being assaulted and having their crypto assets stolen. The amount of those cases that take place in the UK alone is astonishing. So we're seeing that the bit that concerns me is that ordinary criminals are going to realize there's a lot more value that I can easily take off someone in crypto assets and remove from them. And I think that'll start to hit the headlines more and more. But right now it's almost too complicated for everyday journalists to write about. So we're not seeing those headlines because it's just scary crypto in North Korea. I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that one of the biggest threats that exist in the UK is the ease at which people can sort of lose their assets.
Yeah, I think very good points. I think we've got just over 5 minutes left, so I think it's about the right time to open to the panel for final comments. Alison, we start with you.
I would just speak to the fact that with the crypto space, I mean, it is growing at a tremendous rate. Technology is evolving, adapting, but you do have to really look on the horizon, making sure that you're aware of what new threats exist. I mean, now you have state actors getting involved in mining cryptocurrency. You have to look at how much revenue they're getting if it is going to be a big sanctions risk. You have to look at the NFT space. What risks are actually present in the NFT space? Can it be used for things like sanctions evasion? So really just making sure that you're aware of what's on the horizon is critical in this space.
Yeah, I think I feel like we've probably been a bit doom and gloom, if you, depending who's listening in on this. I think obviously we've talked about a lot of the threats and risks, and they're very real and very problematic. But I do think it is important not to take away too pessimistic a picture. I mean, personally, I am quite optimistic about kind of the direction of travel overall. I think, well, there's debate about kind of the exact numbers. I think there's overwhelming evidence that some of the activity we're talking about, North Korea-related activity, cybercrime, I mean, this is a relatively small component, and actually a very small component of overall crypto trading activity, which is now in hundreds of billions of dollars getting traded per day on crypto exchange platforms. When North Korea managed to hit one of them, we're talking small amount relative to what's done globally now. And I think, we've alluded to it before, but the analytical capabilities are getting better. Governments are probably not as quickly as they need to, but catching up in some ways in terms of capacity building. More and more countries are starting to regulate this space, and I think there's just more awareness of the problem. So while we talked about a lot of threats, I am ultimately optimistic that things are headed in a direction where we were talking about before. Financial institutions like the biggest banks in the world are tentatively, but they are starting to get into this space, and I think that's largely because there's a perception there that a lot of this activity can be conducted in a way that is legitimate. And so I think ultimately the picture is still a relatively positive one.
Yeah, you kind of stole my line, but that's and it is that. I mean, I think again I use the 1996 analogy. Take it back even further. I like the Wild West analogy around crypto. I think it's a Wild West because there are lots of really exciting opportunities. I think there is a gold rush opportunity that the right actors will do great things. I think that the problem is with crypto right now is that it's a brutal, harsh Wild West. I mean, if you broke your leg or got sick during those days, you were off to the hospital. You probably get amputated because you had a bit of shrapnel in your leg. Whereas nowadays we have keyhole surgery. So I think we're just seeing the brutal side of it because it is so early in the sector. And when we have those big institutions coming in, Christie's have launched 3.0 Christie's, where they have an entire on-chain experience to buy digital art. I mean, if something goes wrong, you're not going to be told, go check it yourself. You're going to get the usual experience you get with someone like Christie's. So I think as all of those things start to come in, we'll see the standards, and this will be remembered as that early stage. In the same way, I remember having my first desktop computer when antivirus wasn't pretty much like the mandatory thing that everyone had. Tried to download some illegal clip of Man United winning the 1999 treble and wrecked the family computer. And again, I learned that lesson the hard way and had to blame someone else. But nowadays that just wouldn't happen because the antivirus will just work effortlessly in the background. So I'm very optimistic about the future of it, and I think as the big standards will be set by the big establishments, and it's just right now, I think we all get collectively a little bit frustrated because we know that the tools can have a genuine impact that cannot be done in the traditional financial sector right now. And it's just all of the existing reasons, finance and budget and resources and manpower, all the traditional things that affect every other sector are also affecting crypto.
Brilliant. Thank you for those insights, and thanks again to everybody on the panel, those who have tuned in online, and everybody who's attended in person. I believe that there'll be drinks in a couple of minutes in that room, so I look forward to continuing the conversation there.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.